right? Because you guys are in this great enterprise business, and we don't have as much visibility into this, is sort of how you're seeing that play out around all these AI models, right? You're saying like generation over generation, they're just getting so much more efficient and delivering more intelligence than the last generation. And obviously it's all happening super quickly. So I'm not sure kind of what you see in that, but.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, right, which is, we were all, a few years ago sitting around and saying, oh my, what's happened to Moore's Law? Is it over? What do we do? And here we are in some crazy sort of hyperdrive Moore's Law, right? And it's always been also the case, right, which is any one of these tech platform shifts has not been about one S-curve. It's been multiple S-curves that compound, right? Even if you take just the fact that the chips are getting better. People like Jensen or Lisa are doing tremendous innovation. Their cycle times have gotten faster. So let's say that's Moore's Law. But on top of that, everything at the fleet, the system software optimization, the model architecture optimizations, the kernel optimizations for inference, the app server, even the prompt caching, how good we've gotten in. And so you add all of that up for every 6 months, 12 months, you have a 10x perhaps improvement, right? And so when you have capability improvement of that rate and the prices drop at that rate, fundamentally consumption goes up. So I'm very optimistic that we are at a stage where deep applications can get built. And so these things where you have an orchestration layer with these agents, with multiple models, I feel like we're at that place. Because if you think about even the first generation of apps, they were very coupled to one model. But we are finally getting to multi-model applications where I can orchestrate, in fact, a deterministic workflow, an app, an agent that was built on one model, talking to another agent. We even have these protocols are helpful, whether it's MCP, whether it's A2N, whatever. These are all good things. If we can standardize a bit, and then we can build applications that are, taking advantage of, I would say, these capability building, but it has flexibility. And that's where I think open source absolutely has a massive, massive role to play.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to make sure we can get into discussing how to use multiple models together. And I think that there's this whole kind of concept of a distillation factory and the infrastructure around that you think Microsoft is well positioned to basically provide as there are multiple models. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But before we do that, Microsoft obviously has been on this interesting journey around open source, right? And this is one of the big things that you did, under your leadership early on, was embracing it. And you had the early partnership with OpenAI, but then also were very clear that in addition to working with closed models, you wanted to make sure that Microsoft served open models well. And I'm curious how you think about that and how you think that the open source ecosystem is going to evolve and why that's important to your customers and how you think about that with all the infrastructure that you're building.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask that because I grew up, in fact, one of my formative jobs at Microsoft was also making sure that we had interoperability with the various flavors of Unix out there between NT and Unix. And that taught me one thing, which is interoperability is what, first of all, customers demand. And if you do a good job of it, that's good for your business, and obviously you're meeting customers where they are. And so to us, I think that's what has shaped my thinking when it comes to open. I mean, I'm not dogmatic about closed source or open source. Both of them are needed in the world. And in fact, I think customers will demand them, right? Even if any one of us has dogma, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the world will break that way, which is there will be a need for it. So given that, I think, for example, there was SQL Server, there was MySQL, or Postgres. There's Linux, there's Windows. In fact, there is Linux on Windows. In fact, my favorite thing to use is WSL on Windows, because it just makes it easy to take a lot of the dev tools and deploy them on Windows. So overall, I think having a posture that allows you to mix and match these two things is super helpful. It also fits with what you just talked about, because a lot of my enterprise customers want to be able to distill, in many cases, models that they own. It's their IP. So that in that place where an open weight model has a huge structural advantage compared to a closed model. And so I do feel that the world now is better served with great closed source frontier models, great open source frontier models. And to us as a hyperscaler, this is a great thing because after all, our job is to serve. Like if you go to Azure, you can get fantastic Postgres, you can get great SQL Server, or you can get Linux or Windows VMs. Same way, we want to have the choice available and great tooling around it.
Yeah, so what's basically kind of the pitch or the role that you see Azure playing for open source, but I guess across all of these? It doesn't need to be exclusively that. So for developers who are getting started, like where are the areas that you're trying to differentiate and be the best?
So the first thing is, it's not like an AI workload just has an AI accelerator and a model that, at inference time, right? Because the reality is, in fact, if you look at underneath any AI workload, there's storage, right? There is other compute than an AI accelerator, and there is a lot of dependency on the network and so on. So the core infrastructure, so for us in Azure, we want to build compute storage network plus AI accelerators as even infrastructure as a service that's world-class for someone who wants to be able to build the next generation of agents. Then above that, we're also building with Foundry an app server. Like, for example, every platform shift of ours, there's been an app server. How do you package up all the services, search or memory or safety, all of these services that are needed for someone, or evals. These are all things that every developer is trying to go do. So if you wrap them all in, frameworks for them, tools for that, that's, I think, the core. And then the other one is we're very focused on GitHub Copilot as the tooling as well. We're excited about sort of the progress that's making. So the combination of great tools, great app server, and great infrastructure for us is what I think is needed to accelerate application development.
Yeah, so how, you mentioned agents and increasing productivity, and that's obviously a huge theme for the whole ecosystem and community. I'm curious, how are you seeing that play out inside Microsoft? And then also, how are you seeing that, what are some of the most interesting examples that you're seeing with developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that obviously has been most helpful for us to see is what's happened with software development, right? I mean, there are a couple of things. If you look at even the evolution of GitHub Copilot, you started with code completions. Then you said, let's add chat. So that means you don't need to go to Reddit or Stack Overflow, and you could stay in the flow. So that is good. Then the agentic workflow, so you could just go assign a task. So those three things, if I look at even any one of us using it, you're using all three at all the time, right? So it's not like one substitutes the other. And now you have a proto-SWE agent even. And so you can literally go high-level prompt, or you can just get a PR assigned to a SWE agent. So all four of those and the productivity gains, the biggest lesson learned there, Mark, is you got to integrate all of that with your current repo and your current developer workflow, right? I mean, it's one thing to build a new greenfield app, but none of us get to work on complete greenfield all the time, right? So you are working in a large code base with a large sort of set of workflows. So you got to integrate the tool chain, and that's the systems work that I think any engineering team has to do, and that's when you see the productivity. The same applies, quite frankly, for the rest of knowledge work as well. So when, in our case, with Copilot deployment for knowledge work, if you take sales, like one of the things I always describe is let's say I'm getting ready for a customer meeting. The workflow of how I get ready for an enterprise customer meeting has not changed since 1992 when I joined Microsoft, right? Basically, someone will write a report that'll come in email or will be shared in a document, and I'll read it the night before. Now I just go to Researcher in Copilot, and I get the thing which is the combination of what's on the web, what's internal, and even in my CRM, all done in real time. Right? But that's a change, and there's no need for somebody to prepare anything just because it's all available on tap. Yeah. So it requires you to change work artifact, and workflow, and that's a lot of change. And it happens slowly at first, and then all of a sudden, right? I saw that with the PCs, right? I think about how the world did forecasting before email and Excel. like inter-off, the faxes went around. Yeah, I guess you never lived that world.
I was in middle school. Yeah, no, it's.
But there was a world where people sent around faxes and people went and did inter-office memos, and then somebody said, hey, I'll send a spreadsheet and an email, and people will enter numbers. And that changed how people did forecasting. And that's, I think, what we are at the very beginning of. And you see it in customer service. You see it, I think, in marketing, collateral creation, content creation. So that's where we are. And you're seeing tangible progress and tangible productivity gains.
Yeah, interesting. In terms of the coding and how it improves that, do you have a sense of how much of the code, like what % of the code that's being written inside Microsoft at this point is written by AI as opposed to by the engineers?
Yeah, so there are two sort of things we're tracking. One is the accept rates itself, right? That is sort of whatever, 30, 40, it's going up monotonically. And it depends, like one of the big challenges we had for a long time is a lot of our code is still C++. C#, and C# is pretty good, but C++, it was not that great. Python, it's fantastic. So we've now get better at that. So as language support has increased, the code completions have gotten good. The place where the agentic code still, it's sort of nascent. For new greenfield, it's very, very high. But as I said, nothing is greenfield in many cases. And so therefore, I would say maybe at this point, the PR, by the way, code reviews are very high. So in fact, the agents we have for reviewing code, that usage has increased. And so I'd say maybe 20, 30% of the code that is inside of our repos today in some of our projects are probably all written by software. What about you guys?
I actually don't have the number off the top of my head, but I mean, it's, I think, I think a lot of the stats that people say are still effectively of this like autocomplete variety.
Yeah.
But we have a bunch of teams that are working on basically doing feed ranking experiments and ads ranking and like very contained domains where you can study the history of all of the changes that have been made and like and make a change. And that I think is kind of an interesting area for us to work in. But the big one that we're focused on is building an AI and a machine learning engineer to advance the Llama development itself, right? Because I mean, our bet is sort of that in the next year, probably, I don't know, maybe half the development is going to be done by AI as opposed to people, and then that will just kind of increase from there. So I was just curious if you were seeing something similar or different.
I mean, to me, the SWE agent is the sort of the first attempt. So the question for us is, in the next year, can we get, let's take a kernel optimization, right? Will we get to sort of something like that happens? I think it's more likely. Whether it comes up with a novel model architecture change, probably not. So the question is, which task?
Yeah, no, optimization, security improvements, that type of stuff, I think seems like it's pretty high opportunity. Yeah, no, I mean, we're also trying to solve a different problem on it because, I mean, you guys serve like a lot of developers and engineers, that's like your core business. Whereas for us, we're thinking about this more as a thing to improve our internal development and then improve the Llama models, which other people can use. But it's not something that we do the end-to-end workflow on in the way that you do. So it's always just interesting to hear how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and the other thing for us is, to your point, our core business, in fact, Bill started the company as a tools company. And so to us, the interesting thing I think about now is maybe the way we should reconceptualize our tools and infrastructure, quite frankly, are the tools and the infrastructure for the agents to use. Because even the SWE agent needs a bunch of tools. And what shape should they be? What should their infrastructure, what should their sandboxes be? So a lot of what we're going to do is essentially evolve even what does the GitHub repo construct even look for the SWE agent?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting concept. And I mean, I tend to think that like every engineer is effectively going to end up being more of like a tech lead in the future that has sort of their own little army of engineering agents that they work with.
Yeah.
But so with that all in mind, I mean, I guess I mean, there are a few directions to go in. I mean, I'm curious, like how, I mean, you mentioned your personal workflow for using AI. I'm curious how that's changed. I'm also kind of curious because you were talking about how how Microsoft got started on this and the legacy there. But I mean, I guess there's always this question, if you were getting started as a developer today building something, how would you think about which tools you'd be using?
I think that one of the biggest sort of, I'll call it, I don't know, dreams, pursuits, questions that Bill sort of inculcated in all of us was, what's the difference between, he used to sort of talk about it more like, what's the difference between a document and an application and a website? Right now, if you use Meta AI, ChatGPT, Copilot, what have you, it's unclear to me what's the difference between a chat session and then I go to pages in our case, like literally even coming down, I was like reading up everything about Llama 4, all the models, like literally I was just doing a bunch of chat sessions, adding it to a document effectively in pages, persisting it. And then you can go give it. I mean, since you have code completion, you can go, make it an app or what have you. And so this idea that you can start with a high-level intent and end up with what is an artifact that is a living artifact that you would have called in the past an application is going to have profound implications, I think, on workflows. And I think we're at the beginning of that. And that's what my dream is. So if I sort of say, as a builder of infrastructure and tools and as a user of it, these artificial category boundaries, not artificial, or these category boundaries that were created, mostly because of limitations of how our software worked, perhaps you transcend. In fact, the other thing we used to always think about is, why are Word, Excel, PowerPoint different? Why isn't it one thing? And we've tried multiple attempts of it. But now you can conceive of it, right? Which is you can start in Word and you can sort of visualize things like Excel and present it, and they can all be persisted as one data structure or what have you. And so to me, that malleability that was not as robust before is now there.